Catherine Howard's story is one of beauty, passion, and peril. A tale where ambition collides with innocence, and youthful exuberance leads to a tragic fall from grace. At just 19 years old, she captured the heart of one of the most powerful men in Europe, only to see that same love become the instrument of her undoing. Her life at the Tudor court, filled with intrigue and betrayal, is a haunting reminder of the precariousness of power, particularly for a young woman in a world governed by the whims of kings and the strictest codes of conduct. Catherine's fate, sealed within the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, echoes through history, forever etched as one of the most poignant and dramatic chapters in the story of Henry VIII's wives. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of King Henry VIII, occupies a tragic and fascinating place in the annals of English history. Born into the powerful Howard family around 1523, Catherine's life was marked by ambition, scandal, and, ultimately, an untimely death. Her story stands out not only because of her youth and beauty but also due to the dramatic consequences of her brief and tumultuous marriage to Henry VIII, a monarch who was already notorious for his many marriages and ruthless decisions. Catherine's life and death became part of the rich tapestry of court intrigue, betrayal, and the ever-present tension between love and power that defined the turbulent years of Tudor England. Henry VIII's marital history leading up to his marriage with Catherine Howard is essential to understanding the context in which she came to the throne. Henry's first marriage, to Catherine of Aragon, ended in annulment after 20 years, primarily because the king sought a male heir, a dream that his first wife could not fulfill. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, was executed after failing to give birth to a surviving male heir, leaving behind only a daughter, Elizabeth, who would eventually become one of the most famous monarchs in English history. Henry's third marriage to Jane Seymour, whom he adored, finally resulted in a male heir, Edward VI, but she died shortly after childbirth. His subsequent marriages to Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr also had their own political and personal complications, with Anne of Cleves being rejected on the grounds of physical attraction, and Catherine Parr surviving Henry to go on to marry again. By the time Catherine Howard entered the scene, Henry was already a king deeply wounded by the failures of his past marriages and obsessed with securing his legacy. He was an older, more paranoid monarch, with health issues that included obesity, leg ulcers, and mood swings. Catherine, on the other hand, was a young woman in her late teens, lively and attractive, the very epitome of youthful vigor and beauty. Her allure was undeniable, and it wasn't long before she caught the eye of the king, who, despite his age and health, was still a formidable force in courtly affairs. In Catherine, Henry saw a chance at redemption, a return to the youthful beauty and vitality that had once defined his reign. But Catherine's marriage to Henry VIII was far from a fairy tale. The court in which she lived was a place of constant intrigue and danger, where ambition, betrayal, and shifting alliances were the order of the day. The Tudor court was a volatile environment, where one's survival depended on navigating the precarious relationship between loyalty to the monarch and personal ambition. In such a court, a misstep could lead to ruin, and Catherine would find herself at the mercy of the very same political forces that shaped the destinies of her predecessors. The Tudor period was a time of great change, from religious upheaval to shifts in power within the court. Henry's split from the Catholic Church, the establishment of the Church of England, and the subsequent religious tensions created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Catherine Howard's story continues to captivate historians and audiences alike, primarily because of the tragic nature of her life. She was young, innocent in many ways, and yet was thrust into the volatile world of the Tudor monarchy. Her early life, spent largely in the care of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, seemed to offer little preparation for the complex and dangerous world of the royal court. Catherine's relationship with Henry VIII began with great promise, but as her personal history began to surface, it would lead to her downfall. She was discovered to have had premarital affairs, including one with Frances Dereham and another with Thomas Culpeper, a courtier in the king's service. These relationships, which occurred before her marriage to Henry, were seen as a serious betrayal of the king, who had married her believing her to be a virgin. The revelation of her past caused an uproar at court and eventually led to her execution. The reasons for the fascination with Catherine Howard's story lie not only in the drama of her rise and fall, but also in her personal circumstances. Catherine's youth and beauty were seen as virtues, but her lack of education and experience in the complexities of royal life made her vulnerable. Her relationships with her former lovers were used against her, and despite her sincere attempts to navigate the treacherous waters of the Tudor court, she was ultimately outmaneuvered by those around her. Her death, at the age of 19, is a tragic reminder of the dangers that awaited those who were caught in the web of royal politics. Catherine's life was short, but it left an indelible mark on history, as a symbol of both the fleeting nature of power and the vulnerability of youth in the face of political machinations. Catherine's story resonates because it reflects broader themes of innocence, corruption, and the exploitation of women in positions of power. Historians continue to debate whether Catherine's actions were driven by love, lust, or youthful folly, or if she was simply a pawn in the larger political game. Her downfall reflects the double standards faced by women in the Tudor court, where female behavior was scrutinized far more harshly than that of men. Henry VIII himself had many lovers throughout his marriages, but Catherine's actions, though far less scandalous, were treated as a grave offense. Her execution, carried out by beheading at the Tower of London, was a stark reminder of the precariousness of life at court, especially for those who failed to conform to the king's expectations. In popular culture, Catherine Howard has been portrayed as both a tragic figure and a reckless young woman, and these portrayals continue to fuel interest in her life. She has become a symbol of the transient nature of beauty and the ways in which women were often exploited and discarded in the political games of the Tudor court. Her story remains compelling because it highlights the dangers of unchecked ambition, the volatility of court politics, and the fragility of human relationships in the face of power. Catherine Howard's life and death, though brief, have endured as a cautionary tale, one that reminds us of the high stakes in the world of royal intrigue and the price of betrayal in the Tudor monarchy. Catherine Howard was born into one of England's most prestigious noble families, the Howards, in either 1523 or 1524, though the exact year of her birth remains a subject of dispute among historians. Her birth was likely to have taken place in the early 1520s, but because of the lack of definitive records from the time, some historians suggest that 1523 is the most probable year. What is certain is that her early life was both shaped by her family's noble status and marked by significant personal and financial struggles. Despite being a Howard, Catherine's circumstances were far from privileged when compared to the great wealth and political influence the family was associated with in the wider context of Tudor England. The Howard family was one of the most powerful and respected noble families in the country. The family's power came largely through their long-standing connection to the monarchy, especially under the reign of Henry VIII. The Howards had been prominent figures at court for many years, with members of the family serving in key roles such as knights, soldiers, and statesmen. This high status, however, did not always translate into financial security. The Howards' reputation was largely derived from the success of their political maneuvering and social positioning, but their actual financial situation was often precarious. Although they were part of the upper echelons of English society, Catherine's immediate family did not live with the kind of wealth and stability one might expect from such a noble house. At the center of the Howard family's influence stood Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk. He was Catherine's uncle and the most powerful figure in her early life. The Duke of Norfolk was a key advisor to Henry VIII and played a major role in the royal court. He had immense political power, with his personal ambitions tied closely to those of the king. The third Duke of Norfolk's influence on Catherine's life cannot be overstated, as it was largely his position in the court that opened doors for Catherine. The Duke's closeness to the king provided Catherine with opportunities, but it also exposed her to the darker side of court politics. While her uncle's position was influential, it was also dangerous. He had the ability to secure advantageous matches for his relatives, but he also could use them as pawns in his schemes. Thomas Howard was ambitious, as were many members of the Tudor court, and his aspirations were focused on ensuring that the Howard family remained at the center of royal power. The Duke of Norfolk's influence was not just political. It was also familial. His attempts to maneuver the fates of his relatives often had repercussions, as his ambitions for wealth and status created a culture of loyalty and control among his kin. The Howard family had deep ties to the royal court, but Catherine's situation was somewhat different from the more typical, comfortable lives that some of her relatives may have enjoyed. Catherine's parents, Edmund Howard and Joyce Culpeper, were not of the same rank or wealth as her uncle Thomas Howard. Edmund Howard, Catherine's father, was a younger son of the second Duke of Norfolk, and thus did not inherit the vast wealth or titles that would have placed him among the upper echelons of the aristocracy. Edmund's financial situation was poor, and his lifestyle reflected the difficulties faced by many younger sons of the nobility, who were left to find their own way in the world without the wealth that came with being an heir. Edmund Howard's marriage to Joyce Culpeper, who hailed from a prominent family, did little to improve their financial position, as the Culpepers were not particularly wealthy either. Joyce Culpeper was the daughter of Sir Thomas Culpeper, and although her family had its share of influence, they did not have the same level of wealth and resources as the Howards. Edmund's lack of financial stability meant that Catherine and her siblings grew up in a household that struggled to make ends meet. The family was not destitute, but it was far from affluent. For a young noblewoman like Catherine, the lack of wealth and the absence of significant family connections meant that she had fewer advantages than other women at court. She was not raised in the same opulence as some of her contemporaries, such as Anne Boleyn, and was not afforded the luxury of a formal education. Catherine's early life, despite her noble birth, was characterized by a lack of the privileges and opportunities typically expected of women of her rank. Her family's financial difficulties were compounded by Edmund's inability to make a name for himself at court. While the Howard family as a whole maintained its prominence, Edmund's personal failures prevented his children from experiencing the full extent of the family's wealth and power. Catherine Howard's early financial struggles were not unusual for someone of her rank in Tudor society. During the Tudor period, noble families often faced financial difficulties due to the high cost of maintaining a noble lifestyle and the precariousness of royal favor. Despite her noble background, Catherine was not born into the kind of wealth that might have secured her a comfortable life. Instead, she was subject to the same financial pressures that affected many younger sons and daughters of the English nobility. While some nobles enjoyed great wealth and prosperity, many struggled to maintain their positions. This lack of financial security made life at court, where wealth and favor were essential for success, particularly difficult for Catherine and her family. Catherine's early years were spent in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, who was a major influence on her upbringing. The Dowager Duchess, a woman of considerable experience and political acumen, would have provided Catherine with some education, though it is likely that Catherine's formal education was minimal. As a young noblewoman, Catherine would have been trained in the skills necessary to make a good marriage, such as embroidery, music, and courtly manners, but she was not afforded the same level of intellectual education as some of her more privileged peers. Despite her lack of education, Catherine possessed a natural charm and beauty that would later attract the attention of King Henry VIII, making her one of the most famous queens in English history. Though her family's noble heritage and her uncle's political power provided her with some opportunities, Catherine's life was far from secure. As a young woman of limited means and education, she would have been vulnerable to the social and political dynamics of the Tudor court. Her family's financial situation meant that Catherine was forced to rely on the patronage of powerful relatives and influential courtiers, such as the Duke of Norfolk, to advance her social position. Her early life was thus shaped by a mixture of noble lineage and personal struggle, as she navigated the challenges of growing up in a family that, despite its powerful connections, could not provide her with the financial stability and education that might have ensured her success at court. In many ways, Catherine Howard's early life set the stage for her later rise to prominence and tragic downfall. Her family's financial difficulties, coupled with her lack of formal education, meant that Catherine entered the royal court at a disadvantage when compared to other women who had more resources and opportunities. However, Catherine's beauty and charm eventually caught the eye of Henry VIII, and in a court where physical appearance often played a key role in securing favor, she was able to rise above her early disadvantages. Despite the hardships she faced in her early years, Catherine Howard would go on to become one of the most remembered queens of England, though her reign would be brief and marked by scandal. Her story is one of contrasts, between noble lineage and personal struggle, between ambition and vulnerability, and between the glittering promise of the royal court and the dark political intrigues that lay beneath its surface. Catherine Howard's early life, though filled with financial difficulties and social limitations, ultimately propelled her into the sphere of the king's favor, where her beauty and youth would prove both a blessing and a curse. Catherine Howard's early life, while marked by significant hardship, was also colored by romantic entanglements that would ultimately play a key role in her tragic downfall. As a young woman at the Tudor court, Catherine's beauty and charm captured the attention of several men, setting the stage for a series of relationships that would complicate her life and reputation. Among these early romantic involvements were two men who became crucial to her story: Henry Manox and Frances Dereham. Both relationships, though occurring before her marriage to King Henry VIII, would later come back to haunt her and contribute to her eventual execution. Henry Manox was Catherine Howard's first known romantic involvement. He was a music teacher in the household of Catherine's step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. At this time, Catherine was a young girl, likely in her early teens, and Manox, an older man, was responsible for teaching her and her cousins the art of music. It is believed that their relationship was innocent at first, with no indications of it being anything other than the type of harmless flirtation typical of young girls at court. However, the nature of their relationship took a more intimate turn over time. It is said that they began to share private moments and that Manox, enamored by Catherine's youthful beauty, began to pursue her in a way that would have been considered inappropriate, especially given his position in the household. The extent of their physical relationship is unclear, but it is generally accepted that they engaged in some form of sexual activity. This relationship, though it may have been more flirtation than serious romance, was certainly something that could tarnish Catherine's reputation later on, particularly as it involved a man who was part of her domestic service rather than a suitor of her rank. The relationship between Catherine and Manox is often viewed through the lens of youthful indiscretion. Catherine, likely no older than 15 or 16 at the time, was in a vulnerable position. She had been raised in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, where she likely had limited guidance on matters of courtly behavior and relationships with men. While Manox's pursuit of Catherine may have been inappropriate, it is important to consider that, in the context of Tudor society, young women often engaged in relationships with men of lower status or age gaps. However, this early romantic entanglement would come under scrutiny much later, particularly when Catherine's relationship with Henry VIII began to unravel. After her involvement with Henry Manox, Catherine's next significant relationship was with Frances Dereham, a more serious premarital affair. Dereham was an ambitious young man who worked as a secretary for Catherine's family, and he quickly became more than just a household servant in Catherine's life. This relationship was far more intense than her flirtation with Manox and represented the first serious romantic entanglement of Catherine's life. Dereham's position in Catherine's life was much more significant than Manox's, and it appears that the two developed a deeper emotional and physical connection. Their relationship may have been one of love or at least genuine affection, but it was also one that ultimately would have tragic consequences for both of them. The nature of Catherine and Dereham's relationship appears to have been more than just an infatuation. The two reportedly engaged in sexual relations, and their behavior was far more serious than the innocent flirtations that characterized her earlier relationship with Manox. At one point, Dereham is said to have referred to Catherine as his wife, a title that, while informal, indicated a level of commitment that suggested a serious relationship. In fact, the relationship between Catherine and Dereham was serious enough that, after Catherine's marriage to Henry VIII, Dereham was reportedly emboldened by his previous intimacy with the Queen and attempted to insinuate himself into the royal court, seeking favor and advancement. This audacity eventually led to his downfall when it was revealed that he had been romantically involved with Catherine before her marriage to Henry VIII. The significance of Catherine's relationship with Dereham cannot be overstated. Their affair was not merely a youthful indiscretion but a serious breach of courtly conduct, particularly given the nature of Catherine's future marriage to Henry VIII. Catherine's association with Dereham created a political and personal scandal that would shadow her even after her marriage to the king. The relationship with Dereham was particularly damaging because it was secret and occurred at a time when Catherine's position at court was far more precarious than it appeared. Catherine's earlier romantic entanglements were never fully disclosed to Henry VIII before their marriage, and this concealment of her sexual history would be used against her when the king grew suspicious of her fidelity. The courtship culture in Tudor England was markedly different from the norms of modern society. Marriage was often viewed as a strategic alliance rather than a romantic union, and the expectations surrounding courtship were influenced by political, religious, and social considerations. The marriages of Henry VIII were primarily about securing alliances, producing heirs, and strengthening political ties, with love often relegated to a secondary concern. For noblewomen like Catherine, marriage was an opportunity to elevate family status and gain favor with the king. However, this created an environment where women were often under intense pressure to maintain a reputation of purity and virtue. In the case of Catherine Howard, her early relationships were scrutinized not only because of her position as a member of the royal court but also because of the expectations placed upon her as a young woman. At the time, sexual relations before marriage were frowned upon, and Catherine's romantic entanglements, particularly with Manox and Derham, were considered scandalous. While young women of her age were not expected to have much experience with love or sexuality, Catherine's relationships violated the standards of conduct expected of someone in her position. For noble women, the preservation of chastity and virtue before marriage was paramount, and Catherine's behavior was seen as a violation of these norms. The question of whether Catherine's behavior was naive, typical for her age, or scandalous has been debated by historians. Some have argued that Catherine's actions were entirely normal for a young woman in her teens, particularly one living in the chaotic and often morally ambiguous world of the Tudor court. Her relationships with Manox and Derham may have been fueled by youthful curiosity, and it was not uncommon for young women to engage in romantic relationships with men of their household or even with courtiers. In this sense, Catherine's behavior could be seen as a reflection of the typical emotional and sexual development of a young woman who is unaware of the political and social repercussions of her actions. Others, however, contend that Catherine's behavior was scandalous, particularly given the way it was later used against her. In a court where the king's favor was so vital, and where the lives of women were often dictated by their sexual purity, Catherine's actions were viewed as a betrayal of the high expectations placed upon her. Her sexual relationships with both Manox and Derham, though they occurred before her marriage to Henry VIII, were seen as a sign of recklessness, especially in the context of her eventual marriage to the king, who expected absolute loyalty and virtue from his wives. Ultimately, Catherine's early romantic entanglements demonstrate the complexities of courtship in Tudor England. While her relationships may have been fairly typical for a young woman of her time, they were viewed through the lens of political intrigue, social expectations, and religious norms that made such relationships far more dangerous than they might have appeared to Catherine at the time. What was once youthful exuberance became a scandal that not only tarnished her reputation but also led to her tragic and untimely death at the hands of a powerful husband, Henry VIII. Catherine Howard's early romantic entanglements with Henry Manox and Francis Derham were far more than mere youthful flirtations. These relationships, which occurred before her marriage to Henry VIII, were serious enough to have long-lasting consequences. The courtship culture of Tudor England was complex and shaped by social expectations, and Catherine's behavior, though typical for a young woman in her position, ultimately became a significant liability. The nature of her early relationships, combined with the political and personal dynamics of the Tudor court, played a crucial role in her downfall, turning what might have been viewed as youthful indiscretions into a scandal that would define her tragic fate. Catherine Howard's entry into the court of Henry VIII marked the beginning of a dramatic and turbulent chapter in her life. Before her rise to the position of queen, Catherine had lived a relatively modest life, shaped by her noble background but overshadowed by the financial struggles of her family. However, her placement as a lady-in-waiting to and of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, offered her a unique opportunity to enter the royal circle and eventually secure the attention of the king himself. It was here, within the opulent and politically charged environment of Henry VIII's court, that Catherine's beauty, charm, and youthful energy would come to define her rise to prominence. However, as Catherine's entry into the court began, so too did the complex and perilous journey that would ultimately lead to her untimely and tragic downfall. The role of a lady-in-waiting at the Tudor court was both prestigious and fraught with risks. It was a position that allowed women of noble birth, such as Catherine, to gain direct access to the Queen and the royal family, often serving as confidants and companions. For ambitious families, securing a position for their daughters in the royal court was an opportunity to increase their social standing and influence. Catherine's family, the Howards, were among the most influential and politically ambitious noble houses in England, and her entry into and of Cleves' household was a strategic move that furthered the Howard family's position at court. Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife of Henry VIII, had been married to the king only for a brief time, from January to July of 1540. Their marriage was famously annulled after only 6 months, with Henry citing that he had been repelled by Anne's appearance upon their first meeting and finding no physical attraction to her. The court, however, was a place where ambition often trumped personal affection, and Catherine's placement as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves was a clear indication of her family's intent to leverage this royal connection for their own benefit. For Catherine, entering the royal court through Anne's household was a significant step in her life. While it was not unusual for noble women to serve in the Queen's household, the court was an intense, fast-moving, and often dangerous environment. Political intrigue, shifting loyalties, and the personal desires of the king meant that a lady-in-waiting had to navigate complex dynamics with careful calculation. In this environment, Catherine found herself not only serving the Queen but also under the watchful eyes of courtiers and, most significantly, King Henry VIII himself. Court life at the time was a stage where power, influence, and ambition intersected. For a young woman like Catherine, who was still relatively inexperienced and not yet fully aware of the intricate political machinations of the royal court, the opportunity to serve Anne of Cleves was both a privilege and a precarious one. Women at the court were often required to balance their personal ambitions with the expectations and demands of the royal family, especially if they hoped to secure favorable matches for themselves or their families. Catherine, however, would have soon realized that, in the world of Tudor court life, beauty and charm were as important as lineage and political connections. Catherine's rise from a young lady-in-waiting to the king's queen was largely due to the attention she caught from Henry VIII, who was captivated by her youthful exuberance and beauty. Henry, by this time, was in his mid-40s, and his marriages to his previous wives had left him tired and weary of the political intricacies and disappointments that had marked his marital history. His previous wives, Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and Anne of Cleves, had each represented political alliances or personal desires, but they had failed to deliver the satisfaction or stability Henry craved. His first 3 marriages had ended in either annulments or death, and his kingdom was in a state of religious turmoil following his break with the Catholic Church to form the Church of England. By the time Henry's path crossed with Catherine Howard's, he was a man whose once vibrant energy and charm had begun to wane. His reign, which had started with great ambition and the quest for a male heir, had been marred by personal disappointments and the trauma of losing his beloved wife Jane Seymour. Henry's physical appearance had also changed drastically. His once athletic form had become bloated and unhealthy, and his temper had become more volatile. In Catherine, however, he saw something that he had been missing: youthful energy, beauty, and a return to the excitement of courtly life. Henry's infatuation with Catherine was swift and intense, and it is said that he was immediately struck by her charm and vivacity. Catherine, barely in her late teens, had a vitality and innocence that Henry found both captivating and irresistible. For Catherine, Henry's interest represented not just a personal attraction but an opportunity for advancement. As a young woman in a society where marriages were often arranged for political and social reasons, being chosen by the king was a rare and powerful stroke of fortune. However, her courtship with Henry VIII was not without its complications. Catherine, despite her charm and youthful energy, had little experience with the political games that often accompanied royal relationships. Her early romantic entanglements, particularly with Henry Manox and Frances Dereham, had already caused some damage to her reputation, but they were not yet widely known, and Catherine had little reason to believe that they would come back to haunt her in the future. The courtship between Henry and Catherine was a whirlwind, with the king quickly becoming infatuated with her. Henry, already having been through 3 marriages, was no stranger to the process of selecting a wife. He had experienced the political complexities of marrying for power, but with Catherine, he was driven by personal desire. Henry had always favored younger women, and Catherine, with her youthful appearance and charm, became the object of his affection. Their courtship, though fast-paced, was marked by Henry's growing obsession with Catherine's beauty and vivacity. At the same time, Catherine's family, especially her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, saw this as a tremendous opportunity to solidify the Howard family's standing at court. The Howard family's ambitions were clear. By securing Catherine's marriage to the king, they hoped to secure their place at the center of Tudor power. While Catherine's family was undoubtedly thrilled by the prospect of a royal marriage, the young woman herself was likely caught between personal feelings and the pressures of her family's ambitions. As a young noblewoman with limited experience and a history of romantic entanglements, Catherine may have felt both excitement and trepidation at the thought of becoming the king's wife. Her personal feelings toward Henry are difficult to discern, but it is possible that she, like many young women at the time, saw the king's interest as both a personal honor and a way to secure her future. It is also possible that, as with many of Henry's marriages, personal affection took a back seat to political ambition. The downfall of Anne of Cleves played a significant role in Catherine's rise to prominence. Anne's marriage to Henry VIII had been an unmitigated failure, and their union was annulled within 6 months. Henry's decision to marry had been based on political considerations, and had been chosen as a wife to solidify an alliance with the Protestant rulers of Europe, but the marriage had been a disappointment for both parties. The annulment of Anne's marriage to Henry cleared the way for Catherine to ascend to the throne. Henry's eyes, having turned from Anne's unremarkable features to Catherine's youthful radiance, were now fully fixed on the young lady-in-waiting. As Anne of Cleves left the court, Catherine Howard stepped into her place, not only as a lady-in-waiting but as a woman who would soon become Henry's 5th wife. The courtship between Henry and Catherine was marked by passion, but it was also rooted in political calculation. While Catherine was young and attractive, her family was equally eager to secure the match, viewing it as a path to greater political power. The Howards had long been one of the most influential families in England, and Henry's marriage to Catherine presented an opportunity for the Howards to strengthen their ties to the monarchy. Catherine's personal feelings toward Henry are often portrayed as secondary to the political motivations of her family, but it is clear that her marriage to Henry was a turning point for both Catherine and her family. Catherine Howard's entry into the court of Henry VIII was a pivotal moment in her life. Her placement as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves allowed her to move into the royal sphere, where she would quickly catch the king's eye. The courtship between Henry and Catherine, marked by Henry's infatuation and the ambitions of the Howard family, set the stage for Catherine's rise to the throne. While the marriage between Henry and Catherine was undoubtedly driven by political considerations, the personal dynamics of their relationship, combined with the ambitious machinations of Catherine's family, would ultimately lead to the Queen's tragic downfall. The marriage of Catherine Howard to Henry VIII on July 28, 1540, marked the beginning of a tumultuous period in her life, one that would see her rise to the highest echelons of power and, tragically, fall from grace in a short span of time. Catherine, who had entered Henry's court as a young, inexperienced lady-in-waiting, was thrust into the limelight as Queen of England. The ceremony itself, held at the Palace of Whitehall, was a grand event, befitting the union of a young and vibrant woman with a king who, though physically deteriorating, remained one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. The marriage, which took place just days after the annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, was emblematic of the king's swift desires and his unyielding pursuit of youthful beauty. The wedding ceremony was grand, but it was also somewhat unconventional given the circumstances surrounding it. Henry's previous marriages had been politically motivated or strained by personal differences, and his previous wives had often been selected for strategic alliances. In contrast, Catherine's marriage to Henry was driven by personal attraction. The king, struck by Catherine's beauty, had quickly become infatuated with her. However, despite the king's affection, the marriage had political ramifications that would extend beyond the royal couple's private lives. Catherine's marriage to Henry VIII symbolized the continued importance of dynastic alliances and the political calculations of both Henry and the Howard family. As Queen of England, Catherine's role was both ceremonial and influential. In her position, Catherine would have been expected to uphold the honor and dignity of the monarchy, and as a young queen, she would have also been seen as a symbol of fertility and the hope for a male heir. However, Catherine's reign as queen was marked by her youth, beauty, and a sense of freshness that starkly contrasted with Henry's previous wives. In many ways, Catherine was a breath of fresh air for the king, who had grown weary of the political intrigues and personal disappointments that had characterized his previous marriages. Unlike his earlier marriages, which had been marred by religious conflict or the failure to produce a male heir, Catherine's marriage to Henry was imbued with hope for a new beginning. The public perception of Catherine as queen was shaped by her youthful energy and the king's infatuation with her, which made her a popular figure at court. However, the private reality of Catherine's marriage was less idyllic than it appeared. The king, despite his obvious affection for Catherine, had already begun to show signs of physical decline. Henry's health was deteriorating due to his obesity and the numerous injuries he had sustained over the years, including a severe jousting accident that had left him with a painful wound on his leg. As a result, Henry's relationship with Catherine was likely complicated by his physical limitations, and the king's infatuation with Catherine was perhaps more of a desire to recapture the youthful vigor that had once defined his reign. Catherine, though beautiful and charming, was essentially married to a man who was not the vigorous young king he had once been, but a king whose health issues and volatile temper created a difficult and sometimes tense home life. Despite these challenges, Catherine's position as queen was one of immense privilege. She was granted various titles and estates, cementing her status as a key figure in the Tudor court. As queen, Catherine was presented with gifts, lands, and titles that reflected her new position. She was bestowed with various patronages, which granted her the right to control significant wealth and influence. One of the most important of these was the patronage of several monasteries and religious institutions, which were central to the economic and social life of England. Catherine's new status also allowed her to participate in the political and social affairs of the kingdom, although the degree to which she was able to influence policy and decision-making remains a matter of historical debate. Catherine's role as queen, while glamorous and influential, was also shaped by the limitations imposed on her by Henry's established court and by the ever-present political machinations of the Tudor court. The public image of Catherine Howard was carefully crafted by the court and the royal family. As queen, she was expected to embody the ideals of femininity, fertility, and grace. Her youthful appearance and charm made her a popular figure among the courtier class and the general public. She was portrayed as a virtuous and attractive queen, the embodiment of Henry's desire for a fresh start after the failures of his previous marriages. In portraits and official representations, Catherine was depicted as an idealized version of womanhood, youthful, beautiful, and radiant. Her youthful energy and beauty were seen as an antidote to the weariness of the king's previous marriages, and she became a symbol of hope for a new era in the Tudor monarchy. However, Catherine's public image would soon be overshadowed by scandal. The young queen's past, including her earlier romantic entanglements with Henry Manox and Frances Dereham, would come back to haunt her. These relationships, which had been kept relatively secret, were eventually revealed, and they cast a shadow over Catherine's reputation. The revelation of these past relationships, along with the suspicion that she may have been involved in an affair while married to Henry, would contribute to her eventual downfall. The court, which had initially celebrated Catherine's beauty and vitality, soon turned against her as whispers of her past indiscretions spread. Catherine's public image as a virtuous queen was tarnished, and her youthful charm could no longer shield her from the harsh realities of the political world in which she lived. Catherine's marriage to Henry, though short-lived, had far-reaching consequences for her and her family. The Howard family, who had secured Catherine's position as queen, saw their fortunes rise with her marriage. However, as her relationship with the king began to unravel, the Howard family's influence at court began to wane as well. The scandal surrounding Catherine's past relationships and her eventual fall from grace led to the disgrace of several members of the Howard family, including her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who had been a key figure in her rise to the throne. The political ramifications of Catherine's marriage were profound, and her downfall was not just a personal tragedy but also a political one for her family. In terms of patronage, Catherine's role as queen allowed her to distribute gifts and favors to members of the court, further cementing her position. As queen, she was expected to play an active role in courtly life, and her patronage was a reflection of her power and influence. Catherine was granted a large number of estates and lands, which were vital for the wealth and influence of the Tudor monarchy. However, the ultimate fate of these estates was tied to her fall from grace. After her arrest and execution, many of Catherine's lands and possessions were forfeited to the crown, and her family lost much of the influence they had gained through her marriage. The marriage between Catherine Howard and Henry VIII was one of the more brief and tragic unions in the history of the Tudor monarchy. Initially, it seemed like a marriage driven by personal affection, with Henry drawn to Catherine's beauty and youthful charm. However, Catherine's private life and her eventual downfall would tarnish the public image of the young queen. Despite her early success and the lavish gifts and titles that came with her new status, Catherine's marriage to Henry was ultimately doomed. Her youthful energy and beauty could not protect her from the political machinations and scandals that defined life at the Tudor court. The brief reign of Queen Catherine serves as a cautionary tale about the fleeting nature of power and the dangers of personal ambition in the world of royal politics. Catherine Howard's life as Queen of England was marked by a complex and shifting relationship with the court, her household, and her role within the Tudor monarchy. As the fifth wife of Henry VIII, she entered a political and social environment filled with intrigue, rivalries, and deeply entrenched court factions. At the time of her marriage to Henry in 1540, Catherine was just a young woman, full of vitality and ambition, and her position as queen brought with it significant responsibilities and opportunities. However, the short duration of her reign would be marred by scandal, and her life as queen would ultimately be overshadowed by the political machinations of the court and her eventual fall from grace. One of the key aspects of Catherine's life as queen was her household and her relationships with the people closest to her. As a young woman thrust into a position of power, Catherine relied heavily on her household, which consisted of various ladies-in-waiting, servants, and advisors who helped manage her day-to-day responsibilities as queen. Among these individuals, Catherine had a number of favorites, trusted confidants with whom she developed close relationships. These favorites played important roles in her court, assisting her in managing both her personal life and her duties as queen. Some of these figures, however, would later be caught up in the scandal that led to her downfall. Catherine's reputation for kindness and charity was one of the defining characteristics of her brief reign as queen. Unlike some of her predecessors, who had been criticized for their coldness or for engaging in politically motivated actions, Catherine was well known for her warm and approachable demeanor. She was seen as a queen who genuinely cared about the welfare of her subjects, and who used her position to support charitable endeavors. Catherine was especially known for her interest in helping the poor and supporting religious causes, as was common for queens at the time. She was often described as compassionate and generous, qualities that endeared her to many in the court and beyond. Her charitable actions and her caring nature were among the few positive aspects of her time as queen, especially when compared to the scandal that would later engulf her. However, Catherine's relationships with those around her were not always straightforward. One of the most notable aspects of her life at court was her relationship with her stepchildren, particularly Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's daughter from his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The dynamics between Catherine and her stepchildren were complex and often fraught with tension. Mary, who had already endured the loss of her mother and the tumultuous political changes surrounding her father's marriages, was a prominent figure in the court and had strong political views. As queen, Catherine was expected to navigate her relationship with Mary with care, as Mary's position at court and her claim to the throne made her a powerful and sometimes difficult figure to manage. At first, Catherine seems to have made an effort to maintain a cordial relationship with Mary. However, as the months passed, tensions between the two women began to surface. Mary, who had always been loyal to her mother and the Catholic faith, viewed Catherine's marriage to Henry as part of the larger Protestant Reformation that had fractured the English Church. The ideological differences between Mary and Catherine, who likely felt pressure to align with the more Protestant tendencies at court, created an underlying friction between them. This relationship was also complicated by Mary's status as the king's daughter and her sense of entitlement as the legitimate heir to the throne. Though Catherine was queen, she was acutely aware of Mary's presence and influence, and she would have had to tread carefully in order to avoid alienating her stepdaughter. Navigating the dangerous waters of court factions was another critical aspect of Catherine's life as queen. The Tudor court was a volatile and highly competitive environment where individuals vied for power, wealth, and influence. As a new queen, Catherine found herself at the center of a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and betrayals. Her very position as Henry's fifth wife placed her in a precarious position, as she was aware of the precedents set by the previous queens, all of whom had faced political and personal struggles. Despite her youthful charm and beauty, Catherine quickly realized that to survive in the court, she would need to master the art of diplomacy and navigate the ever-changing alliances within Henry's circle. Catherine was particularly sensitive to the factional politics at play within the court. As a member of the Howard family, one of the most powerful noble families in England, she was initially able to leverage her family's influence to secure her position as queen. However, as time went on, the political landscape began to shift. Henry's earlier marriages had created a fractured court, with various factions supporting different members of the royal family. Catherine's marriage to Henry, though based on personal attraction, was also seen by some as an attempt by the Howard family to gain more power at court. As a result, Catherine was continually under pressure to ensure her family's place at the top of the political hierarchy. Despite her efforts to navigate court politics, Catherine was ultimately unable to avoid the dangerous consequences of her actions. Her relationships with certain individuals, particularly her favorites, would later come under scrutiny. The growing influence of Catherine's household and her close relationships with a few key figures led to suspicions that she was involved in a romantic affair. These suspicions would eventually play a significant role in her downfall. However, it is also important to note that Catherine's ability to build relationships within her household was not entirely her fault, nor was it necessarily scandalous by the standards of the time. Tudor court life was characterized by a constant mix of political ambition and personal desires, and the young queen was simply caught in the crossfire. As Catherine's time as queen progressed, her responsibilities grew. She had to manage her public image, maintain her relationship with Henry, and deal with the increasing pressures of court life. Though she was not as politically astute as some of her predecessors, Catherine did have a certain level of influence, particularly over the king's personal decisions. She was involved in matters of patronage, where she could grant favors and influence the allocation of wealth and land. As queen, Catherine also played a role in the royal court's ceremonial life, participating in religious events, state functions, and public celebrations. These activities were central to her role as the consort of the king, and they allowed her to maintain her position within the court. Catherine's growing influence was not without challenges. As the pressures of court life mounted, Catherine faced increasing difficulties in her marriage. Henry, who had initially been so enamored with her beauty and charm, began to show signs of frustration and jealousy. Her popularity at court and the rumors surrounding her relationships with other men created a toxic environment in which Catherine struggled to maintain her position. Her growing influence, once seen as a strength, soon became a liability. The young queen's ability to navigate the court's dangerous waters ultimately could not shield her from the inevitable consequences of her actions. Catherine Howard's life as queen was short and marked by a complex blend of personal charm, political maneuvering, and the ever-present threat of scandal. Her youthful energy and kindness made her a beloved figure at court, but her relationships with her stepchildren, her favorites, and her ability to navigate court factions were all factors that contributed to her downfall. Despite her growing influence and the opportunities that came with her marriage to Henry VIII, Catherine's reign as queen was ultimately overshadowed by the dangers of Tudor court politics. The brief but turbulent nature of her time as queen underscores the precariousness of power at the Tudor court, where a queen's reputation, relationships, and political alliances could shift in the blink of an eye. Catherine Howard's downfall is inextricably linked to the secret affairs that she allegedly conducted while married to Henry VIII. Of these, the most infamous was her relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, which ultimately led to her arrest, trial, and execution. The affair between Catherine and Culpeper remains one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes in the history of the Tudor court, not just for its personal consequences for the young queen, but also because it sheds light on the dangerous nature of courtly life in Tudor England, where secrets were both currency and a perilous game. Thomas Culpeper was a handsome and ambitious young man at court, a figure who had caught the eye of many, including the young queen. Culpeper had come from a well-established family, and his proximity to Henry VIII through his position in the king's privy chamber gave him unique access to the royal household. He and Catherine first met when she was newly crowned as queen, and their interactions quickly escalated into a private and illicit relationship. While there is little direct evidence of the affair's exact nature or how it began, the overwhelming historical consensus suggests that Catherine and Culpeper engaged in a clandestine romance, one that was fueled by both passion and the dangerous allure of courtly intrigue. The affair was not a secret for long, though it was conducted under the radar of the public eye. According to historical accounts, Catherine and Culpeper met frequently in private settings, often in places that allowed them to conceal their meetings from the watchful eyes of the court. It is believed that these meetings occurred at various locations around the royal palace, where the queen would meet with Culpeper under the cover of darkness, aided by the secrecy and the complicity of certain figures within the court. The couple's relationship was facilitated in part by Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, who was a member of Catherine's household and had been involved in the intrigues of the court for many years. Lady Rochford, who had been deeply enmeshed in the dramas of and Boleyn's downfall, acted as a kind of go-between for the couple. She is believed to have been instrumental in arranging their secret meetings and ensuring that their affair could continue without immediate exposure. Lady Rochford's role in Catherine's affair with Culpeper is one of the most controversial aspects of the story. Lady Rochford, a woman whose tragic story is closely tied to the events surrounding Anne Boleyn's execution, had her own complicated history with the court and its politics. After the execution of her husband, George Boleyn, and her sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn, Lady Rochford was a widow without significant support or influence, yet she retained a position at court due to her marriage to George Boleyn and her previous connections to the royal family. Lady Rochford's involvement in facilitating the relationship between Catherine and Culpeper has been the subject of much debate. Some historians argue that she acted out of a sense of loyalty to Catherine, seeking to protect the Queen and advance her own interests, while others suggest that she may have been manipulated or coerced into becoming part of the plot. In either case, Lady Rochford's actions contributed to the events that led to Catherine's eventual downfall. The affair between Catherine and Culpeper was more than just a simple act of passion. It was a violation of the very principles that governed royal marriages. Tudor society was governed by strict codes of conduct, especially for the nobility and the royal family. The institution of marriage was seen as sacred, and for a queen to engage in extramarital affairs, especially with someone outside of the royal family, was an act of treason. The cultural context of the time placed enormous pressure on women, particularly queens, to maintain their virtue and chastity. In the courtly culture of the period, marriage was a political and dynastic tool, often used to cement alliances and secure the future of the realm. The concept of courtly love was a prevalent part of the medieval and Renaissance ethos, where noble lovers often engaged in acts of devotion, chivalric admiration, and clandestine meetings. While courtly love was romanticized in literature and poetry, it was very different from the reality of adultery and betrayal that Catherine engaged in. Courtly love, in its idealized form, was an affair of the heart, whereas Catherine's relationship with Culpeper was one of passion and recklessness, with no regard for the political and personal consequences that would ultimately follow. The courtly love tradition may have provided the romantic backdrop for the affair, but in the real world of the Tudor court, adultery had severe repercussions, especially for women in positions of power. The consequences of Catherine's affair were devastating, and her actions were perceived as not just a personal betrayal but also a threat to the stability of the monarchy. Henry VIII's earlier marriages had already been marked by scandals, and he had endured the political fallout of his break with the Catholic Church and his pursuit of an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. The notion of royal fidelity and loyalty was paramount in the Tudor court, and Catherine's betrayal threatened to undermine the carefully constructed public image of Henry and the monarchy. The question that has plagued historians and biographers alike is whether Catherine truly loved Culpeper, whether she was coerced into the affair, or whether she was simply reckless in her actions. Some historians argue that Catherine, as a young woman, was in love with Culpeper, and that her emotional immaturity and inexperience led her to engage in the affair. She was a girl thrust into a political marriage with an aging king who, despite his initial passion for her, was physically deteriorating. In this context, Catherine's relationship with Culpeper may have been an escape from her increasingly difficult marriage. She may have been seeking the affection and excitement that she had not found in her relationship with Henry. It is possible that Catherine, in her youthful exuberance, did not fully grasp the consequences of her actions or the dangers of engaging in such a high-risk relationship. Others argue that Catherine may not have been entirely in love with Culpeper, but rather that she was driven by a combination of ambition and a desire for excitement. At the time, the Tudor court was a place of intense rivalry, where women at court were often forced to navigate a labyrinth of relationships and allegiances. Catherine, being young and beautiful, had attracted the attention of many suitors, including Henry. But in the context of royal politics, marriage was not just about love, it was about power. Some believe that Catherine, in her pursuit of affection and validation, acted recklessly, without considering the long-term ramifications of her actions. It is also plausible that Catherine, while not directly coerced, felt trapped in her marriage and sought comfort in the arms of Culpeper as a form of rebellion against the rigid expectations placed on her as queen. Finally, there is the possibility that Catherine was indeed coerced into the affair, either by Culpeper himself or by other figures at court who sought to manipulate her. Some scholars have suggested that Catherine was young, impressionable, and perhaps naive in her dealings with Culpeper, and that she may have been taken advantage of by the older man. In the politically charged atmosphere of the Tudor court, where manipulation and intrigue were common, Catherine could have been drawn into the affair by figures who had their own agendas. Regardless of the motivations behind her actions, the affair between Catherine and Culpeper had catastrophic consequences. When the affair was discovered, both Catherine and Culpeper were arrested, along with Lady Rochford, who was implicated in the scheme. After a trial, Catherine was convicted of adultery and treason and was executed on February 13, 1542, at the Tower of London. Her death marked the tragic end of a young woman's life, one that had been cut short by the volatile nature of Tudor politics and the dangers of a courtly life built on secrets, ambition, and intrigue. Catherine Howard's affair with Thomas Culpeper serves as a potent reminder of the complexities of love, ambition, and power at the Tudor court. It is a story of a young woman who was caught in the whirlwind of courtly desires, the weight of royal expectation, and the consequences of her own choices. Whether she was truly in love, coerced, or reckless remains a matter of historical interpretation. But what is certain is that her brief affair would forever alter the course of her life and seal her tragic fate. The discovery of Catherine Howard's past, specifically her previous romantic entanglements before her marriage to Henry VIII, marked the beginning of the end for her reign as queen. What started as a quiet whisper in the corridors of the Tudor court slowly grew into a full-blown investigation, culminating in Catherine's arrest and execution. The accusations that Catherine had engaged in illicit relationships before her marriage were initially met with disbelief by many. However, the events that followed would reveal the dangerous consequences of royal life, where a single misstep or scandal could lead to tragic ends. The suspicion that ultimately led to the discovery of Catherine Howard's past began to build within the court in late 1541, a little over a year after she had married Henry. The rumors were fueled by a combination of factors, including Catherine's perceived behavior, the keen eyes of the court's ever-watchful members, and the political motivations of various figures at court. Henry VIII, who had initially been infatuated with his young queen, was beginning to notice signs of her emotional distance, as well as her occasional lapses in behavior that seemed unbefitting of a queen. The king, already dealing with the aftermath of previous marriages and scandals, was highly sensitive to any signs of betrayal or infidelity. In this climate of heightened scrutiny, Catherine's past began to catch up with her. The first hint that something was amiss came from within Catherine's household. As a young woman in her early 20s, Catherine had previously been involved in two notable relationships before her marriage to Henry VIII. One with Henry Manox, a music tutor, and another with Francis Dereham, a former member of her household. While both of these relationships were not uncommon in the context of the time, they became important pieces of evidence when rumors began to circulate about Catherine's behavior. In particular, the testimony of two individuals would prove to be pivotal in the discovery of her past. John Lascelles, a man who had been closely associated with Catherine's early life, and his sister Mary Hall, played key roles in the uncovering of Catherine's former relationships. Lascelles was one of the first to speak out about Catherine's behavior before her marriage to Henry. In his testimony, he claimed that Catherine had been promiscuous during her time in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. He alleged that she had engaged in intimate relationships with both Henry Manox and Francis Dereham while still a young woman. The implications of such accusations were severe, as they suggested that Catherine had a history of behavior that was deeply at odds with the image of purity and virtue expected of a queen consort. Mary Hall, Lascelles' sister, also provided crucial testimony in the case. She claimed to have witnessed inappropriate behavior between Catherine and Dereham, and even alleged that Catherine had confided in her about her earlier relationships. Hall's statements painted a picture of a woman who, while a member of a noble family, had not adhered to the strict codes of conduct that were expected of women of her status. These revelations were troubling not just because they painted Catherine in a less than favorable light, but because they suggested that she had been deceptive about her past. The fact that she had entered into a marriage with Henry VIII while concealing her earlier relationships raised serious questions about her loyalty and integrity. The testimonies from Lascelles and Hall were not enough to immediately condemn Catherine, but they were certainly enough to raise suspicions. At the time, the Tudor court was an environment rife with intrigue, and every action and word was scrutinized. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a key figure in Henry VIII's court and one of the men responsible for maintaining the king's marital legitimacy, was called upon to investigate the matter further. Cranmer, a man who had played a critical role in the dissolution of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon and the subsequent establishment of the Church of England, now found himself tasked with uncovering the truth behind the accusations against Catherine Howard. Cranmer's investigation into Catherine's past began with an inquiry into the testimony provided by Lascelles and Hall. He was an astute man who knew the weight of his role in both politics and religion. Cranmer understood that if Catherine's past were revealed to the public, it could damage not only her reputation but also the stability of Henry's reign. The king, who had already endured significant marital turmoil, could not afford another scandal. Cranmer's investigation would have to be thorough, but also discreet, as any misstep could lead to catastrophic consequences for the monarchy. The investigation was complicated by the secrecy that surrounded Catherine's earlier relationships. She had been young and vulnerable at the time, and it was clear that the circumstances of her early life had contributed to the choices she made. However, in the eyes of the court, these details were irrelevant. What mattered was the fact that Catherine had concealed the truth about her relationships with Manox and Derham. She had entered into a marriage with Henry under false pretenses, and the consequences of this deception were too great to ignore. The turning point in the investigation came when a letter was discovered in Catherine's private chapel. The letter, which had been written by Francis Derham, was found hidden in a chest during a search of her personal belongings. The contents of the letter revealed the depth of Catherine's relationship with Derham, and it included passionate language that suggested a level of intimacy that was inappropriate for someone who was now married to the king. The discovery of this letter was the final piece of evidence that sealed Catherine's fate. It confirmed the suspicions that had been circulating within the court and provided undeniable proof of her earlier indiscretions. The letter's discovery was not only a devastating blow to Catherine's reputation, but it also ignited a wave of scandal that spread through the Tudor court. The discovery was treated with the utmost secrecy at first, but it quickly became impossible to contain. Word of the letter's contents began to leak, and soon the entire court was abuzz with the news of Catherine's past. In the context of the Tudor court, where public image and honor were of paramount importance, this scandal was one that could not be easily dismissed. The letter, along with the testimonies of Lascelles and Hall, provided enough evidence for Archbishop Cranmer and other court officials to press charges against Catherine. The accusations of adultery and treason were made, and Catherine's position as queen became untenable. She was arrested and confined to her chambers, where she was interrogated about the details of her past. The revelations that followed were shocking, as Catherine was forced to admit to her earlier relationships with Manox and Derham. She explained that these relationships had been a product of youthful folly, but the court was not willing to accept her explanation. For them, the truth of her past, coupled with her apparent deception, was a betrayal that could not be overlooked. Catherine's arrest and subsequent trial were swift. She was charged with committing adultery before her marriage to Henry, a crime that was considered treasonous under English law. Despite her youth and the circumstances surrounding her earlier relationships, Catherine was found guilty. The severity of the charges reflected the gravity with which the court viewed the scandal. Catherine Howard, once a young and beautiful queen, had fallen victim to the political and personal machinations of the Tudor court. The secrets of her past had been uncovered, and her fate was sealed. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London, just a little over a year after her marriage to Henry VIII. The discovery of her past, combined with the testimony of those who knew her, led to her tragic downfall. Catherine's story remains one of the most poignant and tragic in the history of the Tudor dynasty, a cautionary tale of the dangers of courtly life and the ever-present specter of scandal that loomed over those who sought to occupy the highest positions of power. Catherine Howard's fall from grace was swift and brutal, a dramatic shift from the grandeur and power she had experienced as Queen of England. What began as a young woman's passionate courtship with the aging king spiraled into one of the most tragic stories in English history, marked by betrayal, intrigue, and a tragic end. After the discovery of her past relationships and the subsequent accusations against her, Catherine found herself imprisoned in the Tower of London, awaiting a fate that seemed inevitable. Her house arrest marked the start of a painful unraveling of her royal status and her dignity, all of which would ultimately lead to her execution. Her house arrest was a stark contrast to the lavish life she had led just months earlier. Once the queen consort, living in palatial surroundings, Catherine now found herself confined to the gloomy rooms of the Tower of London, a place of imprisonment reserved for the most infamous of royals and political prisoners. The vivid contrast between her earlier life of opulence and the grim reality of her arrest served to underline just how precipitous her fall had been. Catherine was no longer the vibrant and youthful queen admired by the court. She was now a prisoner, accused of the gravest crimes imaginable. In the Tower, Catherine was subjected to intense scrutiny, and her interrogations began soon after her arrest. The Tudor court, known for its political intrigue and the ruthless pursuit of power, did not deal gently with its enemies. Catherine, who had lived in the shadow of power, found herself thrust into the unforgiving spotlight. The interrogations focused on her alleged adultery, the relationship she had before her marriage to Henry VIII, and her involvement with Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham during her time as queen. It was a painful and traumatic experience for Catherine, who, as a young woman, had never fully grasped the magnitude of the dangers she faced within the treacherous world of the Tudor court. Her former lovers, including Culpeper and Dereham, were also interrogated during this time. They were questioned relentlessly about their relationships with Catherine, and both men faced grave charges of adultery and treason. The interrogations were intended to extract confessions from them, and they were no less brutal for the men than they were for Catherine. Both men were coerced into confessing their involvement with Catherine, and their admissions only served to cement the charges against her. Their confessions were damning, providing the court with the necessary evidence to prosecute Catherine for adultery and treason. However, the interrogations also revealed a painful truth. Catherine, though complicit in her past relationships, was not the sole architect of her downfall. The court's manipulation and the pressure placed on her to confess would ultimately contribute to her tragic end. Henry VIII's reaction to the scandal that surrounded Catherine was one of devastation and rage. The king, who had once been infatuated with his young queen, was now heartbroken and furious at the betrayal he felt. His emotions were likely amplified by his increasing age and his fragile health, as well as the deep sense of personal and political insecurity that had characterized his later years. Catherine had been a symbol of youthful vitality, and her fall from grace was a personal affront to Henry's authority and judgment. For a king who had already endured multiple failed marriages, including the painful dissolution of his marriage to and of Cleves, the discovery of Catherine's past relationships was an additional blow to his pride. Henry's devastation was not only rooted in personal feelings but also in the political implications of the scandal. Catherine had been a source of royal legitimacy, and her marriage to Henry had been seen as a consolidation of power and stability within the kingdom. The king's public image was intricately tied to his marriages, and any disruption in his relationships could lead to widespread instability at court. In this context, Henry's reaction was one of intense rage. His outbursts were not merely the result of a personal betrayal. They were also the expression of a monarch who had been humiliated and threatened by the very woman he had once chosen to be his queen. But the king's wrath was not directed solely at Catherine. He turned his fury on those who had been involved in the scandal, including her family members and courtiers who had failed to prevent the affair from coming to light. Henry's anger was all-consuming, and it led to the betrayal of those who had once been her allies at court. The Howard family, once one of the most powerful and influential families in England, found itself embroiled in the scandal that surrounded Catherine. Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk and Catherine's uncle, had once been an important figure at court. However, the scandal tarnished his reputation and brought his family into disrepute. He had been complicit in Catherine's rise to the throne, but as the investigation unfolded, he became an easy target for Henry's wrath. Though the Duke was not immediately arrested, the Howard family's influence began to crumble, and many within the court saw it as a matter of time before they would fall from favor entirely. In the case of Catherine's immediate family, it was her uncle who bore the brunt of the blame. However, others who had been close to her during her rise to power, including members of her household, were also implicated in the scandal. Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, who had been a key figure in Catherine's rise to the Queen's chamber, also found herself embroiled in the investigation. Though her exact role in the events leading to Catherine's downfall is unclear, it is widely believed that Lady Rochford played a part in facilitating the Queen's meetings with her alleged lovers, particularly Thomas Culpeper. The tangled web of loyalty, betrayal, and intrigue that unfolded after Catherine's arrest revealed just how treacherous the world of Tudor politics had become. Allegiances were made and broken, and once loyal courtiers were quick to turn on each other in an attempt to preserve their own lives and positions at court. The betrayal by Catherine's allies was a crucial aspect of her downfall. These were individuals who had once sworn loyalty to her, supporting her during her rise to power, but when the scandal broke, they abandoned her in a moment of desperation. The political climate at the Tudor court was such that survival was often the primary concern, and those who had been closest to Catherine now found themselves at odds with the very woman they had once served. The nature of Tudor court life meant that loyalty was often temporary, and betrayal was a common currency. The betrayal extended beyond Catherine's immediate circle. Even those who had been at the heart of her marriage to Henry VIII, including the king's advisers and courtiers, began to distance themselves from the Queen. Her disgrace was seen as a threat to the stability of the kingdom, and those who had once championed her were now eager to distance themselves from the scandal. The court's obsession with loyalty and the protection of power meant that anyone associated with Catherine risked being dragged down with her. Henry's decision to have Catherine arrested and executed was not just an emotional reaction to her betrayal but a calculated political move. He could not afford to have a queen who had been implicated in adultery and treason continue to occupy the throne. Catherine's fall from grace was swift, and her execution was a grim reminder of the precariousness of royal favor in Tudor England. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed by beheading, a tragic end to her brief and turbulent time as queen. The fall of Catherine Howard serves as a poignant example of the dangers of courtly life in Tudor England, where alliances were fragile, and betrayals could lead to the most tragic consequences. Catherine Howard's final days were marked by an agonizing and irreversible decline. Imprisoned at Sion Abbey, Catherine faced not only physical confinement but also the emotional and psychological trauma of her situation. She had been stripped of the privileges that came with her position as Queen of England, and now, in the cold shadows of impending death, she had to grapple with the consequences of her actions and the punishment that awaited her. Her brief and tumultuous life at the Tudor court had come to an end, but her legacy would forever remain intertwined with tragedy and the ruthless politics of Henry VIII's reign. When Catherine was first arrested, she was initially taken to Sion Abbey, a place that would become her prison in the final weeks of her life. Sion Abbey was far from the splendor and luxury she had enjoyed as queen, with its austere surroundings serving as a constant reminder of the depths to which she had fallen. The woman who had once captivated the king and his court with her youth, beauty, and charm was now isolated and under constant guard, awaiting her fate. The change in her surroundings was a stark reflection of her changing status. Catherine, once treated with deference and respect, was now a mere prisoner, no longer a queen but a woman accused of the most egregious crimes in the eyes of Tudor England, adultery and treason. The emotional toll of her imprisonment was immense. Catherine, only in her late teens or early 20s, had to face the overwhelming realization that she was unlikely to survive the scandal that had brought her so low. Her world, once filled with promise and opportunity, had become a place of darkness and despair. The love and affection she had once shared with Henry VIII were now distant memories, replaced by the cold truth that her marriage was effectively over and that her life was in the hands of a king whose wrath had been ignited by her perceived betrayal. As the days wore on, Catherine was subjected to the intense emotional strain of her circumstances. The reality of her imminent execution began to take hold, and it is likely that she experienced feelings of regret, fear, and isolation. She was completely aware of the gravity of her situation. The court was already moving on without her, with Henry VIII preparing for his next marriage and political machinations continuing unabated. Catherine's fate had become a cautionary tale, and she was left to reflect on how she had arrived at this tragic juncture. In her final days, Catherine would have been offered the chance to confess her sins and to repent before her death. It was a common practice at the time for those sentenced to execution to be urged to make a public admission of guilt, particularly when the charges involved matters as serious as treason and adultery. Catherine's confession, while not documented in its entirety, would have been a crucial part of her last days. It is likely that she expressed remorse for her actions, particularly for the betrayal of her husband, the king. Whether her confession was genuine or merely an attempt to placate her captors is a matter of historical debate, but it is clear that Catherine had come to understand the severity of her crimes in the eyes of the Tudor court. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard's life came to a brutal and violent end. She was executed at the Tower of London, the very same place where many other prominent figures in English history had met their deaths. The image of Catherine's execution has been etched in history as one of the most tragic moments of the Tudor era. The young queen, once so full of promise, was beheaded in front of a crowd that likely viewed her not only as a fallen woman but as a symbol of the dangers of power, youth, and ambition in the volatile world of the English court. The execution was carried out swiftly, with Catherine's head severed from her body in a clean stroke. Accounts suggest that she was calm in her final moments, though whether this was the result of a stoic acceptance of her fate or a final display of courage in the face of her punishment is unclear. What is known is that Catherine's death was a harsh and unforgiving conclusion to a life marked by youthful indiscretions and a tragic inability to navigate the treacherous waters of Tudor politics. Contemporary reactions to Catherine's execution were mixed, though the overwhelming sentiment in Tudor England was one of moralizing judgment. Catherine was often depicted as a young woman who had been seduced by her own desires and the temptation of courtly life, only to be betrayed by her own reckless behavior. In many ways, Catherine's downfall symbolized the dangers of youthful passion and naivety in a court where power and influence were won and lost in a matter of moments. While Henry VIII's actions were seen as a demonstration of his authority as king, Catherine's fate was perceived as an inevitable result of the political and moral expectations of the time. Her execution was also a reflection of the complex gender dynamics at the Tudor court. As a young woman, Catherine was expected to maintain a certain level of purity and obedience, particularly in her role as queen. Her failure to live up to these expectations, compounded by her alleged affair with Thomas Culpeper, led to her condemnation. The consequences for Catherine were far more severe than those faced by men in similar positions, and her execution underscored the harsh double standards that existed for women at the time. Catherine was punished not only for her infidelity but also for her perceived betrayal of the king's authority, a crime that was unforgivable in the eyes of Tudor society. Over time, Catherine Howard's legacy has evolved into that of a tragic figure. Historians and the public alike have often viewed her as a young woman whose ambition and youthful mistakes led to her downfall. She is often portrayed as the reckless queen, a woman whose beauty and charm blinded her to the dangers lurking within the political intrigues of the court. Her story is frequently interpreted as a cautionary tale about the perils of being a woman in a male-dominated society, where the stakes of ambition were extraordinarily high, and the consequences of failure were dire. While some have argued that Catherine was simply a victim of her circumstances, manipulated by those around her, others contend that she was a woman who acted recklessly and paid the ultimate price for her mistakes. In either case, Catherine's tragic end has solidified her place in history as one of the most poignant figures of Henry VIII's tumultuous reign. Her story speaks to the fragility of royal favor and the dangers inherent in courtly life, particularly for women who are often subjected to the whims of powerful men. Catherine's life was brief, and her legacy is one of loss, betrayal, and ultimately, the ultimate price paid for a young woman's mistakes in a time and place where such mistakes were unforgivable. The legacy of Catherine Howard remains intricately tied to both her tragic fate and her position within the complex political and social framework of the Tudor court. Her downfall reverberated through both her own family and the broader dynamics of Henry VIII's reign. While her death marked the end of her brief and tumultuous life, it also had lasting effects on those around her, particularly the Howard family, whose influence was deeply affected by the scandal surrounding Catherine's fall from grace. Her tragic story continues to be revisited by historians, dramatists, and writers across the centuries, each interpreting her life and death through varying lenses. As time progressed, Catherine Howard came to be regarded as both a symbol of youthful naivety and recklessness, and in some interpretations, a victim of the rigid societal norms and gender dynamics that constrained women of her time. The immediate impact of Catherine's execution was keenly felt within her family, particularly the Howard family, one of the most powerful and influential noble houses in England. The Howards had enjoyed a period of significant political and social prominence, largely due to the family's strategic alliances and Catherine's marriage to Henry VIII. However, her scandalous downfall cast a shadow over the family name. The Howard family, once celebrated for its prominence at the Tudor court, found itself embroiled in public disgrace. The third Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, Catherine's uncle, was especially affected by her execution. Though he was not directly implicated in the affair, his familial ties to the Queen made him a subject of suspicion. The family's position at court was weakened, and Thomas Howard's political fortunes began to suffer. It wasn't just Catherine's immediate relatives who were affected. Her fall from grace was a reminder of the dangers of ambition and the precarious nature of royal favor. Despite the fact that Norfolk managed to retain some influence at court, the legacy of Catherine's execution was a cautionary tale for the entire Howard family, whose power and prestige were never quite restored to their former heights. Henry VIII's reign underwent shifts following Catherine Howard's death, as his relationship with women and his outlook on marriage evolved in the aftermath of the tragic events surrounding his fifth wife. After Catherine's execution, Henry was left to reflect on the impact of her scandal on his personal life and the stability of the monarchy. For a king who had already endured tumultuous marriages, including the infamous break from the Catholic Church to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and the execution of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard's fate marked a bitter chapter in the annals of his rule. Henry VIII was increasingly distrustful of women, and the execution of Catherine seemed to harden his view of queenship. His subsequent marriages, including his union with his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, were fraught with tension and political maneuvering. Following the death of Catherine Howard, the king became even more detached from his court, focusing more on his own health and the kingdom's political needs rather than on his queen's. Catherine Howard's demise, as well as the earlier marriages that had ended in execution or divorce, cemented Henry VIII's infamous legacy as a king who was unforgiving and volatile, particularly when it came to matters of love and betrayal. As the centuries passed, Catherine Howard's life and death became a subject of intense historical interpretation. In the 19th century, during the Victorian era, her story was largely viewed through a moralistic lens. The Victorians, with their emphasis on virtue, propriety, and moral purity, saw Catherine's behavior as emblematic of youthful folly and the dangers of ambition. She was often portrayed as a naive and reckless woman who, through her actions, sealed her tragic fate. This interpretation fit neatly into the Victorian narrative of the fallen woman, a trope in literature and social thought that reflected the era's strict moral codes. Catherine was seen as a victim of her own passions, who failed to recognize the inherent dangers of court life. While she was not entirely viewed with sympathy, she was nevertheless depicted as a woman who succumbed to the pressures and temptations of the royal court. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the interpretation of Catherine Howard's life and death evolved with a more nuanced understanding of gender and power dynamics. Historians and scholars began to examine her story within the broader context of Tudor society, and her downfall was increasingly seen as a product of the precarious position of women in the courtly system. Catherine's actions, while seen as reckless, were also viewed as the result of being caught within a rigid social structure that afforded her little agency. The political machinations of the Tudor court, the pressures placed on her as a young queen, and the intense scrutiny of her behavior all contributed to her tragic end. Modern scholars began to ask whether Catherine was truly guilty of adultery, or whether she had been manipulated by others within the court, including Thomas Culpeper, her alleged lover, and the scheming courtiers who may have used her for their own purposes. This perspective painted Catherine less as a reckless young woman and more as a pawn caught in the dangerous game of Tudor politics. Catherine's legacy continued to be shaped by her portrayal in literature, plays, and films, where her story was reinterpreted for each new generation. One of the most notable portrayals of Catherine was in the historical novel The Queen's Fool by Philippa Gregory, which explores the intrigue and emotional turmoil of the Tudor court. Gregory's depiction of Catherine is sympathetic, emphasizing her vulnerability and the manipulations she suffered at the hands of powerful men, including Henry VIII. In this interpretation, Catherine becomes a tragic figure, whose life and death were shaped by the forces beyond her control. Similarly, in dramatic works, Including plays and television shows like The Tudors, Catherine's character has been depicted as both a victim and a seductress, embodying the complexities of Tudor women's roles at court. These portrayals often explore the blurred line between agency and manipulation, illustrating how Catherine's choices were constrained by the political and sexual dynamics of the time. Feminist perspectives on Catherine's life and death have also contributed significantly to her legacy. Feminist scholars have been instrumental in reshaping the way Catherine is viewed, challenging the traditional narrative that often painted her as simply a naive or reckless woman. Rather than focusing solely on her infidelity or perceived flaws, feminist historians have examined the power structures that governed her life and the limited options available to women in her position. Catherine, like many women of her time, had few avenues for independence or escape from the machinations of those in power. Her marriage to Henry VIII, arranged and orchestrated by her family, was a political move that served the interests of others more than it did her own. Catherine was a product of her circumstances, raised in a noble family with ambitious relatives and placed in the most dangerous court in Europe, where her survival depended on her ability to navigate the whims of a king whose favor could turn with devastating consequences. Feminist interpretations of her story have shifted the focus away from her personal failings and placed it on the structural inequalities and the societal expectations that dictated her behavior. In doing so, Catherine's story becomes one of survival in a world where women had limited agency and where the stakes of any misstep were incredibly high. Catherine's legacy is multifaceted. She is both a symbol of the dangers of youthful passion and ambition and a tragic victim of the harsh gender dynamics and political realities of Tudor England. Her death served as a stark reminder of the fragility of royal favor, particularly for women who were judged not only by their actions but also by their ability to conform to a strict set of moral and social expectations. Catherine Howard, though she remains a tragic figure, has continued to captivate the imaginations of historians, writers, and audiences alike. Her life and death stand as a powerful commentary on the perilous nature of courtly life and the limited agency of women in a world dominated by political intrigue and the whims of powerful men. Catherine Howard's life, though brief and tragic, remains one of the most captivating and tragic tales of Tudor England. Her rise from an ambitious young noblewoman to the Queen of England, followed by her dramatic fall from grace and execution, has made her one of the most remembered of Henry VIII's wives. Catherine's life was marked by a series of events that, while common in the royal court, took on far more significant consequences due to the political, social, and gender dynamics at play. Her youth, beauty and vivacity captured the heart of the king, but her eventual downfall, the result of her alleged infidelities and her past indiscretions, would see her sentenced to death at the young age of 19. From the outset, Catherine's life appeared to be one of potential and promise. Born into the Howard family, one of England's most prestigious and powerful noble houses, she seemed destined for greatness. However, her rise to prominence at the Tudor court was not merely a product of her noble birth, but also the result of political maneuvering by her ambitious relatives. Catherine's placement in the royal court as a lady-in-waiting to and of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, was the beginning of her exposure to the court's dangerous politics. It was here that she caught the king's eye, eventually becoming his fifth wife, a role that seemed to offer her a chance to secure her family's place in history. However, Catherine's life at court was far from simple. Behind the gilded walls of the palace, the court was a place of fierce rivalry, betrayal, and ever-shifting allegiances. Catherine was surrounded by political intrigue and constantly under the watchful eye of the king, whose volatile temperament made survival at court a precarious endeavor. While her youthful charm and beauty helped her gain Henry's affection, the very qualities that made her desirable also placed her in a vulnerable position. Her lack of experience and understanding of the consequences of her actions would ultimately lead to her undoing. Catherine's youth and inexperience, combined with her flirtations with men like Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham, set the stage for her tragic fall. The question of whether Catherine was a victim of court politics, a young woman who made a series of naive and reckless mistakes, or a willfully disobedient queen who sought to defy the rules of the court is central to understanding her legacy. Some historians view Catherine as a victim of the ruthless political and social structures that governed the Tudor court. She was young, inexperienced, and caught in a system that was designed to exploit women, particularly those who rose to the heights of power and influence. Catherine's actions, such as her alleged affair with Thomas Culpeper, may have been driven by her personal desires and her attempts to assert some agency within a world where her worth was measured primarily by her beauty and her ability to satisfy the king's desires. From this perspective, Catherine's tragic fate can be seen as the result of the rigid, often unforgiving nature of the court, where mistakes, particularly those related to infidelity, were not merely personal but political sins with dire consequences. On the other hand, Catherine's behavior can also be interpreted as youthful indiscretion, a product of her immaturity and lack of understanding of the dangers of the court. At just 19 years old, Catherine was still very much a young woman, and her actions, flirting, developing relationships with men outside of her marriage, could be seen as a failure to grasp the gravity of her position as queen. It is possible that Catherine's actions were the result of her yearning for affection and attention, something she may not have received from Henry, whose attention was often divided by the demands of ruling and his other wives. Her personal failings, in this light, were the result of her own naivety and inability to navigate the treacherous waters of courtly life. Lastly, some view Catherine as willfully disobedient, someone who acted in defiance of the rules imposed on her as a queen. Her affair with Thomas Culpeper, particularly in light of the court's strict codes of conduct, was seen as a clear violation of the trust placed in her by the king and her position as queen. Catherine's inability to maintain her fidelity to Henry, despite the high expectations of her as his wife, could be seen as a deliberate act of disobedience, one that ultimately led to her downfall. In this interpretation, Catherine's story is not one of naivety or victimhood but one of recklessness and defiance, a reminder of the dangers of challenging the social and political order of the time. Catherine Howard's story continues to captivate historians and the general public, and her legacy endures as a symbol of the youthful passion and tragedy that defined her short life. The fascination with her story is enduring because it encapsulates so many of the themes that make the Tudor period so compelling: love, betrayal, ambition, and the fatal consequences of personal mistakes in the unforgiving world of the royal court. Her rise and fall are dramatic not only because of the political and personal stakes involved but because of her youth and innocence, which makes her story even more poignant. Catherine's life and death are a stark reminder of how fleeting and fragile power could be for women in the Tudor period. Despite her royal status, she was ultimately a pawn in the power games of men, and her fate reflects the vulnerability of women in a patriarchal society. Catherine Howard, in the end, stands as a symbol of youthful energy, beauty, and the tragic consequences of living in a world that valued women not for their intellect or character, but for their ability to please men. Her story reminds us that while love and passion may drive human behavior, they can also lead to destructive consequences, especially when combined with ambition and naivety. Catherine's tragic end at the Tower of London left an indelible mark on the history of the Tudor court, and her legacy continues to be shaped by the ways in which historians, dramatists, and writers choose to interpret her life. Whether viewed as a victim of circumstance, a young woman driven by desire, or a queen who chose to defy the rules of court, Catherine Howard's life remains one of the most poignant and tragic stories of the Tudor era.